Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about mental illness. It was about people who see everything others miss and why this ability destroys them. In his clinical practice, Jung documented patients with what he called differentiated perception. Individuals who could read micro-expressions, sense hidden emotions, and perceive psychological patterns that escaped everyone else. They saw through social masks, detected lies instantly, and felt the unconscious tensions in every room. Jung called this discovery dangerous because these people consistently ended up isolated, exhausted, and unable to maintain normal relationships. Not because they were unstable, but because seeing everything came with a psychological cost no one understood. Today, I'll show you Jung's most dangerous discovery about people who see everything, and why he believed this rare ability either destroys you or transforms you into something extraordinary. The case that revealed Jung's most dangerous discovery began with a patient he described in his private notes. A highly introverted, intuitive type who came to him in 1913 during Jung's own psychological crisis following his break with Freud. This patient, representing what Jung would later categorize as the rarest personality type, possessed what he called undifferentiated intuitive perception. She could walk into any room and immediately sense the psychological atmosphere. Who was lying? Who was in emotional pain? Who harbored secret resentments? Jung wrote, "The patient displays an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others, but this faculty appears to cause her considerable distress rather than advantage. She couldn't engage in small talk because she saw through every social facade. She couldn't maintain friendships because people felt exposed and uncomfortable around her. She couldn't hold employment because her presence disrupted the collective unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning." Jung realized he wasn't treating pathology. He was observing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious, when perception becomes too differentiated for social survival. He documented her describing people with startling accuracy. She speaks of others as if she has access to their private thoughts and hidden motivations. When I verify her observations through careful questioning, prove remarkably accurate. This wasn't psychosis or delusion. This was consciousness so advanced, it had become socially dangerous. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing. This patient's extraordinary perception seemed impossible to explain. Therefore, Jung began investigating what he would later term participation mystique, the psychological phenomenon where individuals with highly differentiated intuition become overwhelmed by unconscious contents from others. Jung wrote in his red book, Period Notes, "There are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not merely conscious communications, but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment." Modern research by Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive persons validates Jung's early observations. Her research shows that roughly 20% of people have heightened sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Jung identified something more specific within his psychological typology: the introverted intuitive type, comprising roughly 1% of the population. These individuals don't just feel deeply, they perceive unconscious patterns with startling clarity. Jung observed that these individuals have what he called a differentiated intuitive function. Their brains process not just obvious social cues, but unconscious emotional states, repressed content, and psychological patterns that others cannot detect. They see the depression behind false smiles. They sense the desperation beneath confident presentations. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. Jung wrote, "The danger lies not in the perception itself, but in the psychic isolation it creates. When one sees clearly what others cannot or will not see, one becomes a mirror that society cannot bear to look into." This creates what Jung called the problem of the superior function, when your greatest strength becomes your greatest burden, because it separates you from collective unconscious participation. But Jung discovered the real danger wasn't the perception itself. Because people with highly differentiated perception see others' unconscious content so clearly, they become targets for what Jung extensively documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously attack those who reflect what they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. Jung wrote in Psychology of the Unconscious, Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. But he discovered that this principle extended far beyond parent-child relationships. It applied to all human relationships. The unlived, unacknowledged parts of ourselves are inevitably projected onto others, and those who see too much are the first to receive that projection. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has only two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. Jung documented this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. The person who sees clearly is often blamed for creating the very problems they are merely observing. His patients with differentiated intuition experienced this endlessly. If they gently suggested that someone seemed troubled, that person would often explode at them for being negative or creating drama. If they expressed concern about obvious relational issues, they were accused of being judgmental, paranoid, or inventing problems where none existed. Jung realized this was not coincidence. It was a form of psychological defense. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he famously wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But for most people, examining themselves is intolerable. It is far easier to attack the person who reflects the uncomfortable truth. Thus, the mirror becomes the enemy, while the shadow remains hidden. This dynamic created what Jung called the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals frequently become the designated problem in every group they enter. Not because they actually cause problems, but because their presence exposes what already exists in the group's collective unconscious. Jung observed, "The bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself." This explains why such individuals don't just feel misunderstood, they feel systematically targeted by a force that is difficult to rationally explain. Groups unconsciously sense the disruptive clarity of the perceptive individual, and instead of valuing it, they project their own shadow onto them. The clearer the perception, the heavier the projection. But Jung's most disturbing discovery was still to come. He noticed that overwhelming perception manifested differently across individuals. It was not a single pattern, but rather several variations depending on how the person's psyche processed unconscious material. From his observations, Jung identified 4 distinct patterns within the introverted intuitive type, each representing a different way of carrying the burden of others' unconscious contents. Type 1. The feeling intuitive. These individuals combined introverted intuition with a differentiated feeling function. They didn't just see what others were experiencing psychologically, they felt it in their own bodies. They absorbed others' emotions so completely that they often couldn't distinguish between their own authentic feelings and those they had unconsciously absorbed. Jung wrote, "The feeling intuitive lives in a state of perpetual emotional contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone in their environment." Their curse was empathy without boundaries, leaving them exhausted, emotionally overloaded, and often unable to function without withdrawing from others. Type 2. The thinking intuitive. This type perceived unconscious patterns as if they were logical sequences, allowing them to forecast behavioral outcomes with startling accuracy. Jung observed that they could predict relationship breakdowns, professional failures, or emotional collapses months before they occurred. Yet this foresight did not arise from rational deduction, it emerged from unconscious pattern recognition. Jung noted, "They possess an uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others cannot yet see." Such clarity made them appear cold or overly analytical, when in reality, they were simply registering the inevitable trajectories that others refused to acknowledge. Type 3. The sensation intuitive. Here, intuition manifested through the body. These individuals could sense the physical expressions of unconscious states in others. They would detect illness before symptoms appeared, feel fatigue in others before it was admitted, or sense bodily tension that revealed suppressed emotional distress. Jung wrote, "These individuals serve as early warning systems for psychological and physical disease in their environment." This gift, however, burdened them with psychosomatic overwhelm, often manifesting as mysterious health complaints that were in fact absorbed signals from others. Type 4. The pure intuitive. The rarest and most fragile type Jung encountered combined introverted intuition with what he described as an undifferentiated auxiliary function. They deceived everything but lacked the structure to process or communicate their perceptions effectively. Jung observed, "They live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving vast amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it." For these individuals, life was often a flood of impressions without boundaries, clarity without grounding. Understanding your specific pattern, Jung emphasized, is crucial. Each type requires different strategies for what he called the integration challenge. The problem was not perception itself, but how one lives with it without collapsing under its weight. But before integration can be addressed, we must understand why Jung considered this discovery so dangerous. He observed that seeing everything without proper integration could destabilize not just the individual, but entire social groups. From his clinical work, Jung identified 3 specific dangers associated with heightened perception. Danger 1, collective unconscious disruption. Jung wrote, "The individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which social cohesion depends. Families, organizations, and societies survive partly by ignoring inconvenient truths, by agreeing, often unconsciously, not to notice certain realities. The highly perceptive individual, simply by existing authentically, violates these agreements. They reveal the cracks in the illusion that binds the group together, and for this reason, they are treated as dangerous outsiders." Danger 2, psychic isolation. Heightened perception separates an individual from others. Where most people connect through shared illusions and mutually reinforced narratives, the perceptive individual lives in a different reality. Jung saw that this often resulted in profound loneliness, a feeling of exile, even within one's own family. He noted that superior perception, if not integrated, creates unbearable distance between the individual and the collective psyche. Danger 3, shadow projection. Finally, Jung warned that those who perceive too much inevitably become targets of unconscious hostility. Because they reveal what others cannot face in themselves, they invite projection of the darkest, most disowned aspects of human psychology. As Jung wrote in Psychology of the Unconscious, nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. But this principle extends beyond families into friendships, workplaces, and societies at large. In other words, the danger lies not in seeing, but in surviving the consequences of seeing. Danger 2, psychological isolation. Carl Jung carefully documented the fate of individuals with what he called differentiated perception, those rare people who perceive psychological realities more deeply than the average person. While such perception can appear like a blessing, Jung warned that it often carries profound risks. One of the greatest is what he described as the problem of the superior function. The superior function refers to the dominant psychological capacity that sets someone apart: intuition, perception, or depth of reflection beyond the norm. For the individual, it often becomes both the greatest source of strength and the deepest well of suffering. Jung wrote, "The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it." What he meant is stark. If you see reality with unusual clarity, you cannot simply hand that vision to others who lack the capacity to understand it. This inability to communicate profound insights creates a painful rift between the highly perceptive individual and the collective. Jung likened this experience to standing on an island while everyone else swims unconsciously in the surrounding ocean. From the island, you see the dangerous currents, the depths, and the hidden rocks beneath the surface. But those in the water are oblivious. When you call out warnings, they dismiss you as paranoid or negative. And when you try to explain what you see, they turn away, unable to comprehend. The result is a devastating form of isolation. It is not merely social isolation where others pull away from the individual, but existential isolation, where one feels as though they inhabit a different reality altogether. Many of Jung's patients described this isolation as unbearable. They felt they were speaking a foreign language that no one else understood. Friendships slowly dissolved, not because of overt conflict, but because mutual understanding broke down. Family bonds strained under the weight of unshared vision. Even professional relationships faltered, as colleagues dismissed or resented insights that seemed disruptive. The deeper tragedy was that the perceptive individual could not unknow what they saw. Awareness, once awakened, could not be reversed. To retreat into the collective dream of unconsciousness was impossible. Thus, they lived in a reality that others refused to acknowledge, and this dissonance left them profoundly alone. Danger 3. Identity dissolution. Yet Jung observed that an even more dangerous outcome awaited some highly perceptive individuals: the risk of identity dissolution. While some experienced isolation from others experienced something more perilous. They lost contact with their own authentic identity. Their heightened sensitivity caused them to absorb vast amounts of psychological material from those around them. Slowly, their inner life filled with borrowed emotions, voices, and instincts that were not truly their own. Jung described this condition using the term participation mystique, a state in which the boundaries between self and collective dissolve. In this state, a person does not know where they end and where others begin. They may feel the anger of strangers as if it were their own, carry cultural grief in their body, or adopt moods that originate outside their psyche. At first, this seems like empathy. But over time, what begins as sensitivity becomes possession. The individual ceases to inhabit their own psychological center. They are pulled into the currents of the collective unconscious and carried away. For Jung, this was the most dangerous threat of all. It was not just social exile, but psychological annihilation. He warned, the danger is not merely exclusion from the group, but the loss of individuality, the complete subsumption of the self into collective possession. Such people risked becoming vessels for the unconscious rather than conscious beings navigating it. Instead of developing their unique personality, they became echoes of the crowd, haunted by archetypes and projections that were never truly theirs. The individuation process, Jung's answer to counter these dangers, Jung developed his method of individuation. This was more than therapy. It was a lifelong process of forging a conscious relationship with both one's unique identity and the collective unconscious. Individuation ensured that superior perception did not destroy the individual, but instead became the basis for authentic development. Jung outlined 3 essential phases. Phase 1, recognition and differentiation. The first task of individuation is learning to recognize what belongs to the self and what does not. Jung called this conscious discrimination. The individual must ask, is this thought or feeling truly mine? Or is it something absorbed from the environment? Without this differentiation, the person risks drowning in the emotions and projections of others. To assist his patients, Jung often prescribed solitude. Time away from others was not meant as withdrawal, but as recalibration. Solitude allowed the psychic sediment of others' influence to settle, revealing the individual's authentic voice once more. It was in silence and seclusion that many of his patients began to feel their own center returning. Phase 2, shadow integration. Jung noted that those who saw the shadows of others most clearly often did so because they had not yet integrated their own. The danger was projection, seeing in others what one refused to acknowledge in oneself. Shadow work, therefore, was central. Jung insisted that recognizing your own capacity for selfishness, envy, cruelty, or weakness does not corrupt you, it makes you whole. By admitting your own shadow, you no longer demonize others for theirs. This humility transforms perception from judgment into understanding. Instead of condemning others for their flaws, the individuated person sees them as part of the shared human condition. Phase 3, conscious participation. Finally, Jung described conscious participation, the ability to engage with the unconscious material of others without becoming overwhelmed or possessed by it. This required developing psychological containers, inner structures capable of holding what one perceives without identifying with it. For instance, a therapist may hear the darkest confessions of a patient without confusing those experiences with their own identity. The individuated person becomes a bridge between conscious and unconscious realms. They can bring hidden material into awareness for others, yet remain firmly rooted in themselves. The case of Nietzsche. A tragic example, Jung often turned to Friedrich Nietzsche as an example of what happens when extraordinary perception remains unintegrated. Nietzsche had surgical vision. He tore through the illusions of religion, morality, and philosophy with unmatched brilliance. He perceived truths that his society was not ready to confront. Yet Nietzsche lacked the balancing force of individuation. Instead of integrating his insights into a grounded personality, he identified with them completely. His perception became his identity. Rather than healing, his vision became a weapon directed at the world and, ultimately, at himself. The result was catastrophic. Nietzsche's isolation deepened into despair, and eventually, madness consumed him. For Jung, Nietzsche was both a cautionary tale and tragic proof. Extraordinary perception without integration does not lead to wisdom. It leads to collapse. Perception as gift or curse. Jung's work reveals that superior perception is a double-edged sword. Left unintegrated, it isolates, destabilizes, and even destroys. But integrated through individuation, recognition, shadow work, and conscious participation, it becomes transformative. Such individuals do not merely survive their perception, they turn it into cultural medicine. They embody what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites in tension until a higher synthesis emerges. In this way, the highly perceptive individual ceases to be a victim of their sensitivity and becomes a pioneer of consciousness, contributing not just to their own wholeness, but to the evolution of humanity itself. The case of Meister Eckhart, successful integration among the figures Jung studied to understand the integration of extraordinary perception. Meister Eckhart stood out as a model of success. The 13th century Dominican mystic embodied what Jung called mystical intuition, a form of perception that penetrated beyond ordinary thought into the depths of both spiritual and psychological truth. Where others glimpsed fragments, Eckhart perceived patterns. He articulated dimensions of human consciousness that many of his contemporaries could not yet conceive. But what made Eckhart remarkable, in Jung's view, was not merely his vision, but the way he handled it. Jung contrasted Eckhart's path with those who became victims of their own superior perception, collapsing into either isolation or possession. Eckhart avoided this fate through what Jung termed conscious humility. He did not wield his insight as a weapon, nor did he alienate others by speaking in ways they could not grasp. Instead, he translated his perception into language that invited reflection. He spoke in metaphors, parables, and compassionate exhortations, offering others a bridge rather than a wall. Eckhart, Jung observed, transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them, but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance. The medieval mystic thus embodied a rare achievement, integration of extraordinary vision with grounded service. His humility protected him from the danger of identification with his insights, and his discipline allowed him to transmit his perception in ways that fostered growth rather than fear. Jung's own integration journey for Jung himself, the struggle was far more precarious. He documented his near collapse during the years 1913 to 1919, a period he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. These years, chronicled in the Red Book, were marked by overwhelming visions, dialogues with inner figures, and encounters with psychic material that bordered on psychosis. Jung admitted candidly, "I was menaced by a psychosis and was saved only by my ability to understand what was happening to me through my work with patients." Unlike Eckhart, Jung did not inherit a spiritual framework capable of containing such experiences. He had to build one. His breakthrough came when he reframed his perceptions not as symptoms of pathology, but as signs of evolution. The unconscious, he realized, was attempting to expand human consciousness beyond the limitations of its current collective form. What threatened to annihilate him could also become the foundation of a new psychology. From this realization, Jung reshaped his clinical approach. He began to recognize that many of his patients with unusual sensitivity were not simply neurotic, but were struggling with the same evolutionary pressure he had faced. Their suffering was not meaningless. It was the price of developing differentiated consciousness. His task as analyst was not to pathologize their perception, but to help them integrate it without being destroyed. The importance of witnesses, Jung emphasized that no one could carry this task alone. The isolation that accompanies superior perception often becomes unbearable without what he called the few who understand. He insisted that individuation requires relational recognition. As he wrote in The Development of Personality, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this privilege cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witnessing by those capable of recognizing that authenticity. Jung identified 3 categories of people capable of providing this kind of witnessing. 1. Fellow individuated persons. These are rare individuals who have themselves undergone individuation. Jung noted that they recognize one another immediately. The encounter feels like meeting an old friend, because both carry an authenticity that cannot be faked. Such relationships are vital because they allow the perceptive individual to be completely authentic without fear of rejection. They are few, but essential for psychological survival. 2. Those actively engaged in individuation. Not everyone needs to have completed the process. Jung observed that individuals sincerely working on themselves through analysis, spiritual practice, or inner discipline are often capable of engaging with differentiated perception. They may not see as deeply, but they value the attempt. Those who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others, he wrote. 3. Natural containers. Some people, though not especially perceptive themselves, have what Jung described as a container function. They are stable, grounded individuals who can absorb psychological content without panic or projection. Often shaped by life experience, loss, or resilience, such people can hold the presence of a perceptive individual without collapsing or becoming defensive. The recognition process Jung provided specific indicators for identifying safe relationships. He encouraged perceptive individuals to pay close attention to how others responded to their insights. Certain behaviors revealed psychological safety. They asked genuine questions rather than rushing to defend themselves. They could admit personal contradictions without shame. They demonstrated psychological mindedness, curiosity about inner life. They remained emotionally steady when confronted with uncomfortable truths. They displayed curiosity about growth and consciousness. When these markers were present, deeper disclosure could unfold. Jung even developed what he called a gradual revelation protocol. Begin with gentle observations, watch for response patterns, and increase depth only if curiosity outweighs defensiveness. Always, he insisted, frame insights as offerings rather than pronouncements. The goal was not agreement, but dialogue. Individuation as service. Ultimately, Jung believed that successful integration of superior perception was not only for the individual's sake, but for the collective. In The Undiscovered Self, he wrote, "The individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society. Those who integrate superior perception become what he called culture carriers, bridges between the unconscious and conscious, helping society evolve." This is why Eckhart's example mattered so profoundly to Jung. The mystic's humility, service, and ability to articulate profound perception without alienating others demonstrated what integration looked like in practice. And it is why Jung's own confrontation, harrowing as it was, became the foundation for his life's work. He learned that the gift of seeing deeply carries with it the responsibility of learning how to bear it for oneself and for the collective. In the end, the fate of those with extraordinary perception depends on whether they choose isolation, collapse, or integration. Meister Eckhart showed that humility and service could transform vision into nourishment. Jung's own life proved that even near madness could be turned into wisdom when courage and discipline were applied. Together, their paths illuminate the possibility that what feels like curse can become gift not only for the one who sees, but for the world that needs new vision to evolve. The 4 stages of transformation. Carl Jung often emphasized that the journey of individuation is not a straight path, but a spiral, a continual return to deeper layers of the self with new awareness. Nowhere is this clearer than in the process of integrating what Jung called superior perception, the heightened intuitive and psychological sensitivity that some individuals carry. For Jung, the key was not simply to have such perception, but to integrate it consciously, lest it become destructive to both the individual and those around them. This process, he suggested, unfolds in 4 transformative stages. Stage 1, recognition without overwhelm. The first transformation occurs at the threshold of awareness, recognizing one's heightened perception without being overwhelmed by it. Jung referred to this as conscious acceptance of the superior function. For many, the first realization of their unusual perception brings anxiety, shame, or even fear of madness. Jung himself lived through such terror during his confrontation with the unconscious. This stage is crucial because without recognition, perception remains unconscious and manifests as overwhelmed visions, emotional floods, intrusive insights, or psychic confusion. But when accepted consciously, perception becomes less like a flood and more like a river that can be directed. Stage 1 stabilizes the psyche, offering a foundation for deeper integration. Stage 2, integration without isolation. Recognition alone is not enough. The second transformation requires learning how to use perception constructively while maintaining meaningful human relationships. Jung called this social individuation, the ability to be authentically oneself without retreating into isolation. Many individuals who awaken to superior perception feel the temptation to withdraw. Ordinary social interactions may seem shallow or draining. Yet Jung warned that individuation is never about escape. He observed, "The individuated person does not withdraw from the world but engages with it more consciously." Integration means testing one's insights in relationship, finding language that others can understand, and shaping perception into dialogue rather than monologue. It also means learning boundaries, how to perceive deeply without imposing one's perception as a burden. This stage transforms perception from a lonely burden into a bridge, allowing connection without distortion. Stage 3, service without sacrifice. Once perception has been integrated into both inner life and relationships, the third transformation emerges, turning perception into service. Jung called this conscious participation, the act of using one's gifts in ways that benefit others while still maintaining one's own psychic health. Here, perception is no longer carried like a secret weight. It becomes a resource for guidance, healing, or teaching. Jung expressed this beautifully. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and then to offer that authentic self in service of the whole. The key distinction is service without sacrifice. Many deceptive individuals fall into the trap of giving themselves away entirely, exhausting their vitality in helping others. True service, however, flows from fullness, not depletion. This stage requires the discipline of self-care, ensuring that one's contribution is sustainable. At this point, perception becomes not just a personal gift but a cultural medicine. Stage 4. Legacy without attachment. The final transformation is what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to use one's perception in service of collective consciousness without being attached to recognition, reward. In this stage, the individual becomes a culture carrier, contributing to human evolution by articulating truths that society is not yet ready to accept. Jung observed, "The individuated person works for the future, not for personal recognition in the present." The integration becomes cultural medicine. This stage involves letting go of egoic ownership of one's insights. One speaks, writes, creates, or teaches, not to be praised, but because the content itself demands expression. The measure of success is not applause, but the quiet certainty that one has participated in the unfolding of consciousness. Here, the individual's life becomes symbolic. Their presence itself becomes testimony that deeper perception can be lived without collapse, arrogance, or despair. This is legacy, not personal achievement, but contribution to the ongoing evolution of human consciousness. Pitfalls along the path. Jung was clear that the path of transformation is perilous. Many individuals derail their process through specific psychological traps. He documented at least 4 common dangers. 1. The inflation trap. Inflation occurs when the ego identifies with superior perception itself, mistaking the gift for the self. This creates what Jung called the prophet complexer, belief in possessing absolute truth. Jung warned, the danger is that the ego identifies with the archetype, leading to an inflation that cuts the individual off from human relationships. Inflation breeds arrogance, isolation, and unconscious possession by the very forces the individual seeks to master. 2. The withdrawal. Justification, another danger, is retreating completely from society, rationalizing disengagement as spiritual superiority. Jung noted that withdrawal often masks fear of engagement. He cautioned, "True individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not escape from it. The hermit who withdraws from life has not transcended it, but has been defeated by it." 3. The helpers hijack some fall into addiction to helping. They define themselves entirely by their usefulness to others, losing touch with their own development. Jung warned, when perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function. This is not individuation, but its opposite, the sacrifice of personality to role. 4. The overwhelm return, even mature individuals can regress. Stress, trauma, or life transitions may break down boundaries, flooding them again with unconscious material. Jung emphasized that integration is not permanent, but requires ongoing vigilance. Integration is not a permanent achievement, but a dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention. The integration maintenance. Jung developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy integration. Regular solitude for distinguishing your own psychological contents from absorbed material. Conscious choice about when and with whom to engage perceptive abilities. Ongoing shadow work to prevent projection of your own unconscious contents. Connection with others capable of providing reality checking and support. Creative expression as an outlet for overwhelming perceptual input. Jung wrote, "The integrated person does not achieve perfection, but learns to dance consciously with their own psychological complexity." The service without martyrdom. Jung's crucial insight was that superior perception serves evolution best when it's integrated consciously rather than suffered unconsciously. The goal isn't to be a martyr to consciousness, but to be a bridge between what is and what's becoming. Jung wrote, "The individuated person serves the collective not by sacrificing their individuality, but by developing it so completely that it becomes a gift to the whole." The ultimate integration. At the highest level of development, Jung observed, individuals with superior perception hold their abilities lightly, seeing clearly without attachment to others, accepting what they see, perceiving deeply without compulsion to fix everything they observe. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to serve consciousness evolution naturally, without forcing or preaching, simply by embodying more conscious ways of being. Remember Jung's patient from 1913, the introverted intuitive who came to him during his own psychological crisis. After 3 years of working with Jung's individuation process, her life transformed completely. She learned to distinguish between her own psychological contents and what she absorbed from others. She found work as a counselor, where her differentiated perception helped troubled individuals. She built relationships with people who valued her insights rather than fearing them. Most importantly, she stopped experiencing her superior perception as a curse and began understanding it as what Jung called a gift requiring conscious development. Jung wrote about her transformation. The patient learned not to see less, but to see more wisely, not to perceive less deeply, but to engage more consciously with what she perceived. Her gift remained intact, but her relationship to it became integrated, rather than overwhelming. This represents Jung's most dangerous discovery, that some individuals are born with consciousness that exceeds collective readiness. And this advanced perception will either destroy them through isolation and overwhelm or transform them into exactly what humanity needs for its psychological evolution. Your superior perception isn't a malfunction in your psychological makeup. It's an advanced feature of consciousness development. You're not broken because you see everything others miss psychologically ahead of your time. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological development that transcends collective unconscious limitations. If you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights about psychological types that don't fit conventional patterns, check out my video on 7 dangerous Carl Jung psychology places that destroy your mind, where I reveal the psychological environments that are particularly toxic for highly sensitive and perceptive individuals, and Jung's strategies for protecting your consciousness while engaging with an unconscious world. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.